Testing. There we go. Well, welcome to our adult forum today. We have a special guest speaker, David Weiss, and his wife,
Yes.
Margaret Schuster.
I got your name.
David was our guest for the Process and Faith event a while back. Was it three months ago? Anyway, and we were so pleased with him. We thought, oh, we got to get him here for church here. So, so he's help us kind of navigate where should we be going as a church in time of climate change, where it's getting more and more dire looking. What should our voice be? So I'll just let him more himself and get onto this, because we've only got the 45 minutes, and we have Zoom tonight. So think of questions or whatever to go on with that conversation tonight, and David will join us then too. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I'm excited. I was especially delighted to hear about the Zoom option tonight, because every time that I speak in the morning, inevitably over lunch, I typically debrief the conversation with my wife, and I think about a dozen things that I wish I would have said, and my guess is you will think over the course of the day about a dozen things you wish you would have asked about. And so it'll be fun to come back together this evening and see what has simmered during the day. I think two things I'll say, and then we'll pull the PowerPoint up. One is, as was mentioned in the announcements today, so I identify myself as a public theologian. Sometimes I add the word itinerant in front of that, because I don't have any connection any place any longer. I don't have any institution that supports me. I do this by the seat of my pants and by the love of my wife, who has full-time work and keeps us housed and fed and clothed and whatnot. I have a master's degree from Wartburg Seminary. I chose not to pursue ordination, and I made that choice with fits and starts. I quit after each of my 3 years and finally decided, okay, I'll take a master's degree, and then I went on and did a second master's in Christian ethics at the University of Notre Dame. I taught religion and theology for about 20 years at Luther College, and then up here in the Twin Cities at Augsburg and St. Kate's and Hamline. And all the teaching in the Twin Cities, about 15 years of it, was as an adjunct instructor, which is a very grinding way to earn your keep. And I sort of burned out on it, and because I published a collection of essays on welcome to LGBT people while I was teaching at St. Kate's, and I rankled some feathers there that were concerned about that. And then I led the drive to organize a union for adjunct faculty at Hamline that was successful, and was the end of my teaching at Hamline. And so I'm henceforth itinerant. The other thing that I should say is that this is very much a work in progress, even in process. I was delighted to get the invitation to speak on this topic to the Process and Faith Forum, and I have sensed this is now my third iteration of it, and each time I'm trying to pitch it for the people that I expect to be here. Of course, I had no idea who would be here this morning, but this is where I think. It's things that keep me awake at night, and I'm trying to figure out how do I talk with other people about that. So let's go ahead and pull the PowerPoint up, and we'll begin. Just 3 things to notice here: leaning into the wind, resurrection faith, and the scale of the ecological crisis. The leaning into the wind is evoking that Pentecost is around the corner, and in some ways, Pentecost brings the church into being, sets the church on fire. What does that mean for us today? Resurrection faith, that somehow, and you may agree with me by the end of this, as we think about climate change and the ecological crisis that we're on the precipice of, we need a faith that is willing to stare death in the eyes and not blink. And resurrection faith is what allows us to do that. And then lastly, the scale of the ecological crisis. as I think about this, it seems to me that one of the most difficult things for people in the pews is to grapple with the scale of this. And so that's where I want to go today, is the scale of it. So here is my too long didn't read slide. Everything that I say is right here, and you're going to get this in a handout at the end. So basically my message is that for the well-being of the church and for the tending of our human family as a whole and for the healing of creation, the church must, and I have sorry in parentheses because nobody likes to hear what you must do, and yet this is also my way of saying that my dire conviction is that these are kind of non-negotiable things for the church to take on at this point, that we must become zealous for abundant life measured by the depth and health of our relationships to one another and to earth, not measured in dollars and cents. And if we're honest, most of us, even in the church, have had our desires colonized by a culture which tells us persistently to measure abundance in terms of dollars and status. Second, that we must preach, teach, and foster awe, sort of a radical wonder, and gratitude as a function of Christian discipleship. That we have to do the same with lament as the essential posture of reverence for creation. We might like it to be joy, but it has to be lament. That we must cultivate community and simplicity as though our lives depend on these virtues because they will, and that we must come to terms with finitude, that is bluntly put, with death, as part of creation's goodness, because the scale of the ecological crisis is such that we who hold resurrection faith have a peculiar charism and calling in the world today. Now, this coming to terms with finitude, this is a tricky one for Christians because we want to say that resurrection faith conquers death, that it overcomes death, that we'd like to be able to say, "Oh, death, where is your sting?" And it seems to me that there are real reasons to suggest that the heart of the ecological crisis is that we globally have become a people who don't take death nearly as seriously as we ought to. That we live in a world where the goodness of the world, the very awe of the world, is interwoven with finitude. And somehow we have to grapple with that. So I'm not going to look at slides like this today. I have dozens of slides like this. I'll just say a word about these two, and then we're going to dispense with them. So the one on the left shows the rise in global temperatures. You probably have seen slides like this before. It's getting worse and worse. We're getting redder and redder, and the notation at the bottom simply shows that from COP1, that's the first gathering of the Conference of Parties, the United Nations group that is trying to coordinate a global response to climate change. COP1 met in, I think that's 1975 there. That print is too tiny for me. And COP26 was just this past fall. And you see from COP1 to COP26, this is the UN rallying the world to respond to climate change. And that red line is just getting higher and higher all the time. The one on the right is an image just from this past week out of India, April 29th, 2022. You can just see how red hot India was. But those little gray areas in the rural areas in the center of India are places where satellite imagery was putting the temperature in India at over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the world that we're grappling with. So you have a handout here in front of you, and this is my attempt to try to give us a sense of the scale of what we're up against. We're going to think about some stuff on the scale of a walk across Earth's history, and we're beginning from the state capitol, and we're heading to the ticket gate of the state fairgrounds. So, and that happens to be, I didn't plan it this way, I didn't make this up, it actually happens to be the route that I'm going to take you through 4.6 miles, which matches up very neatly with the 4.6 billion years of Earth's history. And we're going to skip over, or I'm going to buzz by a lot of this, but you see, if we leave the front steps of the state capitol, almost by the time that we cross that very first street, the moon has formed. Somewhere very soon along University Avenue, oceans appear. The first life shows up before we even get to Dale Avenue, and then we take Dale Avenue north to where we can pick up Como and start cutting a diagonal along Como. That multi-celled life appears 1.9 billion years ago. That's right about where the railroad tracks cross Como, right before you get to Como Park itself. We walk through Como Park, and more or less where the old streetcar is along the edge of Como Park is where higher algae appears on the scene. And higher algae is responsible for producing the majority of oxygen, especially in the ancient world. We're going to walk then through Como Park, and this is what kind of blew my mind even when I made this up. So we'll switch now. We have just hit the edge of Como Park, and at the edge of Como Park, we pick up, Midway Parkway, that just runs from Como Park to the State Fairgrounds. And it's right there as you're leaving Como Park is the Cambrian explosion. This is responsible for trilobites and all kinds of other diversity in the oceans 550 million years ago. Somewhere just a block outside of the park, we have back-to-back mass extinctions. Mass extinction number 1, mass extinction number 2, right about halfway between Como and the State Fairgrounds. We have the forests on land and kind of the explosion of land life, amphibians, reptiles, bugs, 300 million years ago. Then we have a huge mass extinction. It's that large black dot right in the middle. It's the Permian mass extinction. 95% of all life on planet Earth was wiped out halfway between Como and the State Fairgrounds. It's really just, this is like 2 blocks from walking through the tickets is where dinosaurs appear. And they cover about a block of time there. And then you see that small dot, mass extinction number 5. That's the asteroid that took the dinosaurs out. And so it is really that last half block of Midway is where the age of mammals appears, crossing Snelling and heading into the State Fairgrounds. Now, one thing you need to notice on here, there's that long black line. It runs a 1/4 mile. It's right underneath mass extinction number 3. That long, thick black line is the time frame, 250 million years, 1/4 mile, that all of the oil on Earth today, every bit of it, was formed during that 250-mile period. Everything more recent than that has not had time to become oil yet. So all the oil we have is right there. And I think it says up here, it doesn't say it on your handout, up here it says, during these 250 million years, photosynthesis used ancient sunshine to trickle charge Earth's battery in the form of building up all this fossil fuel. So now you have this little strip of handout, because on this scale, 4.6 miles from the state capitol to the State Fairgrounds, this represents how long Homo sapiens has been around. 12.8 inches out of 4.6 miles, we've been on the scene. The last little edge of it, it's about 3/4 of an inch, is how long we have been here as civilization. This is roughly the last 12,000 years during which the climate stabilized and we were able to develop agriculture and build cities and whatnot. And this is what will blow you away. If you turn this on its side, the thickness of this piece of paper on a scale of 4.6 miles, the thickness of this is just a little thicker than the last 200 years, which would represent the Industrial Revolution. This is how long we have been burning fossil fuels, and during this amount of time, we have burned through half of that quarter mile of oil that is available. Half of all the oil on planet Earth has been used up in this amount of time. And it is the amount of oil, this I've just talked through, it is the amount of oil that is available for everything that we ever want to do with oil, and the half that we've burned through that quickly is the easy oil. It's the oil at the top. It's the stuff that's easiest to get to. This stretches that out over about, what is that, from 6,000 years ago off into the future. And what it's basically trying to say, which is the same thing that I did with that map, is that we are experiencing right now, our 20th century human civilization was built on a carbon pulse. We figured out how to tap in to Earth's battery, which was charged over 250 million years. And in some ways, we got so punch drunk on what fossil fuel could do for us that we have blown through it like we imagine that it's going to last forever. And we are somewhere very near the top crest of that carbon pulse. So this shows that last 3/4 inch on your strip is that Holocene era when climate has finally stabilized enough so that we could develop crops and grow them. It's the tail end. This only shows half of Homo sapiens because it goes back to 100,000 years rather than 200,000 years. What happens really just in the last 70 years, the Great Acceleration. This is what scientists refer to when they talk about that we have actually probably left the Holocene era and entered what scientists increasingly refer to as the Anthropocene, the era in which anthropos, the human being, is the leading driver of change of the world's climate. And most scientists will say that it started sometime around 1950, which is the little date circled in red at the bottom. And what this chart shows, everything, all of the bullets on the left, those are in shorthand, those are measures of our status, of our worth as human beings when it's measured by dollars or social status. So we have increasing population, GDP, foreign investment, water use, paper production, fertilizer consumption. These are all the things that are making the world better and better and better because of stuff. And the bullets on the right are all of the measures of the stress on the Earth system because of all the stuff that we're accumulating. And the graph overlays all of those bullets on top of each other. And what you see is that as all of our measures of success are skyrocketing upward, so are all the measures of stress on Earth's system, which is why this is much bigger than simply CO2 emissions. It's running the entire planet down. This is a map of what's called Earth Overshoot Day. It's the day at which we as a global civilization have used all of the resources that planet Earth can resupply in a 365-day year. And what you see, the very first column on the left is the year 1970, and it's actually that 1970, December 30th, is the first year in which there were so many people using so much stuff over the course of the year. On December 30th, we used up our annual allotment, and December 31st, we were borrowing or stealing from the future. But what you see is that red bar, which is us going in red, continues to drop every year. And it goes up a little bit during 2020 because of the pandemic. But right now in 2021, last year, We hit Earth overshoot as a planet on July 29th, which means that the last 5 months of 2021, we were stealing from the future. If you tally this up over this is now a 52-year period, we've actually used 65 Earth's resources in 52 years. So we have clawed off of planet Earth the next 13 years of resources. We're already in the red for those. But it's actually worse. You can't see this very well, this little inset, but obviously, not every country consumes at the same rate. And in the United States, we consume at such a rate that we actually hit Earth overshoot for 2022 almost 2 months ago. I think it's March 13th. I forget the exact date. March 13th. So from March 13th onward, in the United States, everything that we're consuming is either, sadly, it's either stuff that is being stolen from poor people on the planet right now who have a right to it, or from future generations.
David, is that based on the share of the world population?
Yep, share of the world, yep, and share of how much we're consuming. Yeah. So what this tries to show here is up in the top right-hand corner, it shows how climate was kind of bouncing up and down, and in the Holocene, it really leveled out. And what levels it out in the Holocene is a whole bunch of, they're referred to as Earth systems, different ways that whole systems on the planet worked to kind of smooth the climate out so that we could actually grow things. Not that Earth's system was thinking that that's what it was trying to do, but the effect of those Earth systems reaching climate stability is what allowed civilization to unfold. And you might think of those Earth systems, they've identified 9 of them shown up around here, as hands holding on to a big trampoline, and there are 9 people with their hands spaced around this trampoline, and they're holding it taut so that humanity can bounce up and down and develop civilization in the middle. But what's happening, this set of charts here, it's another way of envisioning that great acceleration, because all the red charts is all human stuff, human success going up, and the blue charts are all stresses on Earth systems going up. So it's just another way of showing that great acceleration chart. But the effect of it is that we're not only bouncing up and down on the trampoline, but every now and then we're bouncing over near the edge and stamping on one of the sets of hands that is holding the trampoline steady. And what you can see here is they're saying, we've released so many novel entities, that's really man-made toxins or nuclear radiation that we've released. And we've damaged so much biosphere integrity with population species extinction. We have climate change unfolding. We've changed so much of land from its pristine nature into developed land. These are biochemical flows, the way that phosphate and nitrogen are moving. All of those red areas are where human beings are stepping on these hands. And what happens when enough of these hands release is that there's no way that our climate is going to be steady any longer. And then ultimately, this is like my last graph slide. This comes from work done in 1970, this famous study commissioned by the Club of Rome called Limits to Growth. What happens if, in fact, we use up so much of the planet that it can't restore itself? And it simply suggests, way back in 1970, that sometime around the year 2030, that we're going to reach a point of no return. That we're going to reach a point when Earth itself simply cannot sustain the rate of growth that we've insisted on having as the way of life that we think is due us. So this is, I started out probably 7 or 8 years ago thinking as a theologian about climate change and thinking about CO2, and over the last 2 years, while I still think about climate change, I really think about the entire ecological impact of human life as we know it on the planet itself. And it strikes me that even if we rein in CO2, this is one of the things that unnerves me about the talk about, well, we'll replace fossil fuels with green energy. I am all in favor of green energy. A couple years ago, Margaret and I put solar panels up on our rooftop. We love them. We drove up here today in a Prius hybrid. I'm absolutely in favor of green energy. I think it is fantasy to imagine that green energy can be scaled up fast enough to replace that carbon pulse, because it's going to drop off really fast. And there are whole sections of things that we do with oil that are going to be a lot harder to do with wind or with solar or with battery power. And there's a guy that I follow, Nate Hagans. He's a professor at the U of M who talks about this. He refuses to call solar energy or wind energy as renewables. He refers to them as rebuildables, because we have to rebuild the technology every 25 to 30 years because it wears out. And it's true that the wind is renewable, but our harnessing it is rebuildable. The sun is renewable, but our harnessing is rebuildable. And we wind up needing to scrape deeper into Earth's crust in order to rebuild it every time. So, here's where we get theological. Oh yeah, and you can send these handouts. I'm down to my last 4 slides now, and I've got a handout with the last 4 slides because these are the things that we can talk about this morning and the things that we can come back and talk about tonight. So making sense of this crisis, voices in the wind. We're not quite Christian yet. We're coming to our wind, which is Pentecost wind. But these are other people who are thinking about this crisis the same way that I am. So Ernest Becker, in I think around 1968 or so, wrote a famous book called The Denial of Death. And Sheldon Solomon is a social scientist who's actually done research to verify some of Becker's claims. And Sheldon is the person who developed what's called terror management theory, which says that our efforts to suppress our death anxiety are the mainspring of human activity, that in some sense, and if you think about this, this makes sense. At the point that we became self-conscious, self-reflective human beings, from that point on, every human being, from around the time that they reach adolescence, they live with the awareness that death is waiting for them at the end of their lives, and that death might show up unexpectedly at any point in their lives. Dogs don't carry that burden of awareness. So far as we know, we are the only creature on earth. Maybe elephants can anticipate it on the short term. Maybe some of the marine mammals can anticipate it on the short term. But so far as we know, if we look at our literature, if we look at our theology, if we look at our philosophy, we are the only creature that spends our whole life anticipating our death. And Ernest Becker went so far as to say that in his estimation, everything that humanity has done has been to try to deal with this existential terror inside us about dying. He would say the pyramids were built to prove that we were somebody here and now and that death can't take that away from us. He would say that 401ks do the same thing. So that they're intended to keep this anxiety in check. So you maybe can already imagine resurrection faith, rightly held, may be a way to deal with that. And then there's this woman, Joanna Macy, developed it's called The Work That Reconnects, and it's in this book called Active Hope. And she basically says that there are fourfold steps to developing active hope. I don't know that Macy's in conversation with Sheldon Solomon, but she would say that active hope is a way of lessening the anxiety of death in our lives. So cultivate gratitude and awe. It's not just making a list of, oh, I'm thankful for this, I'm thankful for that, I'm thankful for that. It is letting yourself sink into a sense of gratitude or awe at something. To honor the world's pain. Macy would say that we spend most of our lives running away from the fact that every time we pick out a new piece of clothes from a clothing rack, almost every time that we walk into a grocery store, every time that we turn up our thermostat during the winter, that we are stuck in a system. It's not that we're bad people, it's that we're stuck in a system that sells us clothes that are built on exploitation, that heats our homes by extracting fossil fuels that are we're stuck, we can't get out of it, and the world is suffering because of it. And Macy says that we spend almost all of our lives trying to avoid feeling that pain. And she says that the mystical truth is that if we allow ourselves to feel the pain of the world, what happens is we remember that we are intimately related to everything else that is, and that actually jumpstarts the power of empathy for all of creation inside us, and that we need that radical empathy to move forward today. So then we can act. Two other voices to mention. Oops, I lost stuff. Here we are. Transition Town movement. There's Transition Town movement, pretty active one down in St. Anthony Park here in the Twin Cities. Says basically four things. This is a movement that was based on the notion that we're going to run out of oil. What happens when we run out of oil? They say we need to begin planning for a less energy-intensive future, because if we don't plan for it, we're just going to hit the wall. That we need to build communal structure and resilience for the coming disruption. It is going to get rocky, and we need to start linking arms right now. That we need to start now collectively, not waiting for the government to act, but start collectively on our own. So this is church work. And their biggest claim is that there are life ways, there are ways of being human culture that are more locally rooted, authentically connected, deeply rewarding, and in touch with the limits of our planet. Transition Town is convinced that there are ways that we could actually find our lives extraordinarily meaningful that don't have to be dollar intensive. And then deep adaptation also is built on the premise that there are really rough times coming ahead, and so that movement recommends that we develop resilience, which is a way of asking, what are the things we want to make sure we hold on to? That we develop a practice of relinquishment, that we ask the really hard question, if we can't have it all anymore, and if maybe we never should have been assuming that we can have it all, what are the things that we're willing to start letting go of right now, because we're going to have to let go of stuff? Restoration. What are practices that we have lost that we want to restore? Or things that we see other communities doing well that we want to emulate? And finally, reconciliation. What are the things, the persons that we need to make peace with as we move forward? So now I ask the question. Those are these other voices in the wind. Some of them have a sort of spiritual quality to them, but none of those people are speaking from a Christian perspective. How do we lean into our wind? This is that same thing that I had as too long, didn't read at the start. So you can take this home with you. And here's where we come to, though. This is the last slide. And so on the left here, I've got just bullet points of all these other voices. It just runs through them. On the right side, I ask, and I don't have answers for you, but this is the question I ask as a Christian theologian. What are the seeds that are being carried by our wind? What are the gifts that Pentecost brings to us in this moment? And some ways to think about it are to ask, what would it mean for us to be an apocalyptic, which is to say a truth-telling, an end-announcing, a grief-evoking church? What would it mean for us to be an evangelical, which is to say a hope-bearing, a life-giving, a gratitude-guiding church? What would it mean for us to be a prophetic, community-weaving, abundance revisioning, finitude-embracing, simplicity-modeling church at home on earth? Now, I will step into the murky water, not on abortion this morning, but on life after death. I don't know what happens after we die. I don't know whether there is some heaven that is waiting for us or not, but I believe deeply in the goodness and the sufficiency of the planet on which we are, and it seems to me that we have not done a sufficient job of saying, we are home here now. This isn't just a way station. Maybe there is something even better than this waiting for us, but this is home now, and somehow we need to fully grasp that. Another way to frame the question, what is it to do justice, show mercy, and walk humbly now? Micah 6:8 has got like universal, timeless relevance across the ages, and it's an important question for us to ask again. How will resurrection faith and a spirit-filled church take life today in light of the challenges in front of us? And then specifically, because this is where I think it gets really interesting, how might rituals like baptism and communion, or confirmation, marriage, funeral, even simple church fellowship, how might those things which churches have been doing for generations, how might they embody good news even in this kairos moment? This is a moment that is full of peril, but also full of promise. And it seems to me that it's a moment in which we need not simply to ransack the attic, but in some ways to ransack the bulletin. When you look at the activities coming up in your congregation this week, where are the places that you have the opportunity to be apocalyptic, evangelical, or prophetic, or to redefine what abundance is, to reframe what finitude means, to build community? These are really critical things for us to do, to teach awe and gratitude as discipleship, to find ways to lament as the essential posture of what it means to show reverence for creation today. So, that's as far as I've gotten. And it's a big task. It's unwieldy. It keeps me up at night. And I am eager in the handful of minutes that we have remaining and in the follow-up Zoom time tonight to hear from you ways that my words have maybe prompted questions or sparked insights. And I can entertain a few questions or comments here, and then I'll be excited to join you again this evening.
And if you can wait for the mic, that would really help in Zoom. Any questions, any comments?
It almost, I don't know if this has come across or not. Right there?
Yep.
Okay. When I think of doing justice, I think of providing for poor people what we don't have. That seems to be counter to the survival of the planet. And I'm wondering if the planet is in such poor shape that's hopeless, and we should just be making peace with the world and being ready to pass on to what's next.
That is a hard, honest question to pose. The research shows that the majority of Earth's resources are being consumed by kind of a thin upper crust. And so, in some sense, the multitudes of the poor are not putting anywhere near the stress on the planet as those of us who probably fall into the top 10%. It is also the case that somehow raising the poor up from absolute destitution is more sustainable than simply kind of saying there's nothing that we can do for them. I would say, though, that those of us at the top, that we really need to wrestle hard with how do we scale back from where we are, because there is a happy medium, but it is way below where we are today. I've heard people say that a sustainable life, in fact, we saw it on here, would be around a late 1960s lifestyle in Europe. Europe has always been more frugal than we have here. Some of that is a matter of our geography. Some of it, an awful lot of it, is bound up with our sense of exceptionalism, that we must do things our way and we dare not learn from anybody else. So could we imagine sliding back to a 1960s lifestyle? We hold on to our medical advances, but we let go of every house needing to have 1 or 2 or 3 big screen TVs. We let go of needing to turn in our cell phone every 2 years to get a new model or something. But I can't say that with certainty. If you look closely at that limits to growth chart, their prediction was that by the year 2100, that our population would peak somewhere between 8 and 9 billion, and it would collapse down to about 3 billion in the next 80 years, simply because there was no way in their projections that we could hit the brakes fast enough. And so there is, the deep adaptation people are right at the heart of that question. How do we make peace with what is coming our way and be ready to pass the baton on to whatever comes after us, which is probably not going to be human civilization? That is not where I am, but there are people out there who say that's what's in the cards.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think as you were talking about, I think the big question here is, how does the world work? It looks like we got a lot of sand in the gears, and there are some big problems here, not just wars, but resources in the world, the distribution of these, and we got some big problems.
Yes, and so you're right. It is really, in some ways, it's about how the world works, which means that it can be extraordinarily overwhelming for any one of us, or even for any small community of us, because you can't rework the economic systems yourselves, but you can question the economic systems, and you can begin in little ways to practice living at odds with the larger economic systems. But I think that this is one of the places, and so we do need to ransack our attic, when the Apostle Paul says that we contend not simply with flesh and blood, but with the very principalities and powers at play on the planet. I would say systemic injustice falls into that category of principalities and powers. It's principalities and powers that make it virtually impossible for me to buy anything other than sweatshop-produced clothes. I don't choose that, but I walk into a clothing store and almost everything on the rack was made in a third world country. And so how do we find power for ourselves to lean into the wind differently? And we can't change it overnight, but I do think there are things that we can do that give us a sense of power and calm, but it involves being realistic that we're not going to remake the world, but we can certainly call for it to be remade.
I've been retired. I was one of Minnesota's principal policy experts and with the HESO, and I'm going to talk about a small group you could deal with, but it's still the largest education group in Minnesota. It's called higher education. There's only about 200,000 students, or a little more than that there. And we worked at redesigning in the 80s and 90s the liberal arts requirement in Minnesota. And it was very controversial, but it did happen. What I would suggest is, but remember, I just qualified that I've been out of touch for a generation, that we look at, through HESO, Higher Education Service Office, what we could do at least as an elective within what's called general studies, the first 2 years of higher education, that this should be explored. We should give the brightest and the best, and again, they're also in plumbing, and don't get me wrong, and mechanics, but we should give them the opportunity to have this information, be aware of it, and to let them work with it.
Yeah. Those are powerfully important remarks. I want to lift them up because even scientists today are saying that we have the science all worked out, not down to the nth detail, but we know what is driving climate change, we know what is driving Earth overshoot, and that really from this point on, it's a conversation about human values and human motivation, and liberal arts is the heart, bringing the humanities into the conversation, which is why religion has a really vital role to play in also reshaping where our values are at.
I already answered this, but do you have any hints? I mean, we're so polarized in so many things. Do you have any hints? I'm talking to people who don't get this and who are just so polarized, America first.
So I don't have any short answers for that. I mean, that's the big question, because I have people in my family who fall into exactly that category, people whom I love dearly that I can't have this conversation with. I am constantly racking my imagination for how do I do that. Coming up with this map that I used in the thin strip of paper is a way to try to jog people's awareness. But here's a fascinating thing. If you're intrigued by this person, Sheldon Solomon, whose work fascinates me, and he's on the handout. The name is on the handout there. If you look up, there's a short introduction to his work in an issue of the Sun magazine that you can find online. It was, I think, April last spring. But this is what Solomon found in his research, is that we develop, not simply do we build pyramids in 401ks, we develop worldviews. And our worldviews, which can be our religious convictions, are what anchor us in a sense of worth against the oncoming onslaught of death. And this is the sad, messy truth that he found, but we saw it play out during the pandemic, is that we try most of our lives to keep death at the edge of our consciousness, and sometimes it creeps forward. And during the pandemic, especially the early months as we watched that rise, death couldn't be avoided. And what his research found is that when death creeps into our consciousness, people take their worldviews and they double down. And in some sense, we saw on the conservative end, we saw people saying, I'm not going to wear a mask. I want the stores opened up. Because their worldview said everybody takes care of themselves, we all get what's coming to us, and I'm looking out for number one. The people on the liberal end of the spectrum, Sheldon would say, were that they dipped into higher levels of altruism than they would in their ordinary daily lives, because altruism was part of their worldview, part of how they pacify the nibblings of death at the back of their consciousness. And so liberals became more liberal, conservatives became more conservative, and my unhappy suspicion is that that polarization may continue, but I want to figure out, is there a way that we can do an end around on that? And I haven't figured it out yet, but the research says it drives us further and further apart, which does not forebode well.
Time really has come to an end. We want to thank you so much, and please come back tonight. Overwhelming. But this is a good chance to really have a good conversation about what we want to be thinking about. Thank you so much.